Certainly good to see all of you today, and it's just wonderful to see the building slowly start filling back up. And it's been encouraging over the past, 3-4 weeks. It seems like we add about 5 or 6 more every Sunday over the past 3 or 4 weeks, and so it's just been encouraging, and hopefully everybody's staying healthy and glad to see everybody. So those who are still having to be at home, I'll warn you ahead, even if you're hearing me now, there are some network issues going on in and around our area. I noticed some issues when I loaded the system up this morning that they're out of our control. So if I freeze for half a second here or there, I'm not doing the robot here in the pulpit. It's just the computer system's buffering a little bit today. So there may be some hesitations moment to moment today. But for those in the house, you'll be just fine, hopefully. I want to go into this text here in Daniel chapter 5. It's an interesting thing. We could run all kinds of directions, right? There's an interesting scene here that unfolds with Belshazzar and this handwriting on the wall that God presents unto him. And we could run 1,000 miles in different directions as the various things we could learn from this text. And so I'll try not to run in every direction today with you. But I do want to look at the narrative and learn some things from this moment where God has to humble Belshazzar because he's pretty proud of himself. And not really in ways that he should even be considering that the successes that he is experiencing really are on the heels of the successes of Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar was receiving those benefits because God decided to use him in order to bring challenge and difficulty to God's people. And so here's this obstinate, proud scene, this really in some ways despicable scene as Nebuchadnezzar had brought back the vessels out of the temple of God, and Belshazzar has decided to throw this drunken party, and instead of just using whatever utensils they had in his own disposal, he decides to tell them to bring me those vessels that they brought back from the temple, and let's use those in order to have our celebration and party scene that unfolds here. And I appreciate Tanner reading for us those first 5 verses of Daniel chapter 5 that kind of set this scene of pride and false security. You know, this celebratory mode that he is in seemingly shows his idea of invincibility, that there's nothing that can touch him, reach him, challenge him, that everything that he has accomplished and received is untouchable, and very quickly that disposition will turn. For as they've brought the gold and silver and actually have been given credit for all those successes to the gods of gold and silver, of physical, natural things, and they drank wine there in verse 4 and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. Then verse 5, in the same hour the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. And it's interesting that he notices this hand, and yet it's the message that's going to be written that's going to be significant within this process. Because in this tremendously pride-filled, celebratory, blasphemous in so many ways as he's using the utensils and vessels of God for this celebration. In the midst of all of it, God enters the scene and changes the equation immediately. Lesson number 1 maybe for us this morning is simply this: don't ever underestimate what God can do in any moment in time. When we think all things are out of control, or when we think all things are just exactly as I want them to be, or we get ourselves into our mindset of somehow that a situation or a circumstance is untouchable, God can enter any scene. That's why we should be praying about our world condition right now. That's why we need to be petitioning the Father to intervene and act upon the needs of mankind in our present circumstances. Because in any moment of pride, in any moment of power being wielded uncontrollably, in any moment where there are men and or women doing things that are contrary to human existence in some senses, or more importantly, contrary to the will and purpose of God, He can always enter the scene, and when He does, He changes it. In verse 6, then the king's countenance changed. From celebration, from pride, to lack of humility, to being humbled instantaneously, as he witnesses and watches this hand begin to write this note on the wall opposite the lampstand. And his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosened and his knees knocked against each other. You know, I've heard people say sometimes that they were so scared their knees knocked, but they really didn't. His did. The text says he trembled in such manner, his hips loosened, his knees began to bang against one to the other because of the fear that finally overtakes him and the recognition that all the while he thought he was in control, he's not in control at all. When God enters a scene, He can change it, and He can change it instantaneously. And Belshazzar learns very quickly the challenge of that. And friends, let me suggest to you that when there are sinful things, and put your marker there in your Bible in Daniel chapter 5, we'll come back in a minute. But when God decides to bring judgment, and when God decides to change a scene, it's His will, and nothing can be done against it. It's still a fearful thing to think that God must enter the picture at times, and the same power that He demonstrates back here that we're going to continue to study in a moment out of Daniel chapter 5 hasn't changed by the time Paul writes to those in Rome in Romans chapter 14 and in verse 11. For it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow. His knocked, all of them at some point in time when judgment comes will bow. And every tongue shall confess to God. And so then each of us shall give account of himself to God. You know, here's the difference. Some knees will bow in admiration and in awe and in respect of God, whom they've honored and served and respected from out whatever time they had on earth. Some of us will bow before Him because we've come into the presence of Jehovah God, whom we've been honoring and serving throughout our lives. Some will be brought to their knees because He brings them to their knees. The choice is yours and mine. How I respond to this mindset or this idea or this principle that every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess, I can come into judgment, I can come into eternity willingly prepared for that moment to bow before the great Jehovah God, or I can come into that scene and be brought to my knees just as Belshazzar was brought to his knees, knocking against each other. God still demands that same level of respect as He did in the days of Belshazzar, and you and I need to respect and humbly respect that same power today. It hasn't changed. Though God may deal with men differently, though He may not approach us in the same manner, though there might not be a specific handwriting on the wall that you and I get to physically see, the message of God hasn't stopped, and we can continue to appreciate that if He decides to bring judgment and consequence to choices and behaviors, He still has power to do so. But here's what's interesting. Go back to Daniel chapter 5. So Belshazzar, right response in some senses, fear sets in, knees are knocking. So he cries aloud in verse 7 to bring in the astrologers. It hasn't occurred to him that the fact that he has blasphemed Jehovah God by bringing the vessels from the temple into this celebratory situation, it hasn't occurred to him yet that that might be the problem. And so he calls for his astrologers, the Chaldeans and the soothsayers. And the king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Well, in their world, those are pretty good options, and so I suppose anybody would be trying to figure that out, right? I'll take the jewels that the king is offering and be elevated to third within the leadership and rule over the kingdom, if I can just figure this out. And now all the king's wise men, verse 8, came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. Pause for a minute. Here's the thought. He's seeking help from his trusted sources, but he's relied upon all the wrong things. You and I need to be cautious and careful from whom it is we seek advice and counsel. Sometimes what we do is we look for someone to echo what I've already decided about a situation. That's not real counsel. When I seek counsel, I need to be willing to seek someone who will just simply tell me the truth about a circumstance. Whether I've already adhered to that or made that same connection or not, I need someone who can genuinely bring help to me. They weren't going to be of benefit to him. But he called for those that he was closest to first. But now he's got a problem. He brings them and none of them can figure it out. None of them were of any help. Verse 9, then King Belshazzar was greatly troubled. His countenance was changed again, after the first time even worse, and his lords were astonished. Even those who were closest to him had never seen him this way. Friends, there are going to be a lot of folks who stand before God in judgment, and they are going to appear in ways that they've never appeared before. There are going to be a lot of folks who have to kneel first. Every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess. But there are going to be a lot of folks whose countenance is completely different in that moment where they realize I am legitimately accountable for the things I said, did, and acted upon here in this earth. And I have to answer not to my fellow man, not to the counselors that I've built trust in, but I have to answer to the Jehovah God who created me. He's going to weigh me in the balance. That scene's going to be far different. His countenance changes when he realizes the answers and the places that he had commonly sought answers can't provide it. You know, I'm cautious because I don't want to imply to folks that, well, just wait till you hit rock bottom and God will be the only option you got. I don't want to imply that to you because that's the wrong mindset to have about it. But here's the unfortunate reality. The unfortunate reality is that happens to a lot of people. It took hitting rock bottom and they look around and they can't find answers anywhere. They've got nothing. Everything that they had grown accustomed to using or seeking advice from or being of help to them, none of it works. And now all of a sudden, where am I going to look? And my point maybe is simply this. If it took that, okay, that's not great, but okay, let's look to the Lord now. We've wasted enough time seeking benefit and strength. We've filled ourselves with pride. We've let humanity kind of dictate to us the way we should think and behave and make choices. If I'm honest about the fact that those trusted sources have now left me empty, maybe there's a better source in which I should have been seeking help. Maybe there are some real answers out there. Not just appeasement or not just ways to make me feel better, but there are real answers if I'll look to God to find them. And friends, that's not a scary thing. That's a beautiful thing. Belshazzar had to learn it in a moment of fear. We can learn it and appreciate it from a moment of acceptance and appreciation, and that's a far better way to grasp that concept. Don't wait till your knees are knocking before you realize that God has great answers to life. Don't wait until I've hit rock bottom to realize that the answers and the benefit and the strength that God will provide has always been accessible to me. If it takes that, so be it, but let's maybe learn that quicker. The queen, verse 10, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall. The queen spoke, saying, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the Spirit of the holy God. And in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief among the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Inasmuch as excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation. Your father had a guy in the kingdom that was smarter than everybody else. I'll give you the summation. And every time there was an enigma, every time there was a riddle, every time there was something that needed interpreted or explained, or a dream that didn't make any sense to the king, he had but one guy that he really relied upon. But notice she even recognized that the reason Daniel was who he was because the holy God was with him. Did you catch that? She even recognizes that there's something peculiar about Daniel because of his God, not because of he himself. Call for him. Call for the one who can bring genuine help here. Call for the one that your father trusted. Call for the one who Nebuchadnezzar had raised above others, because the holy God of Israel is with him. There are real answers available if you'll but seek him. And so he does that. He's brought before the king, and there's this conversation, and we won't spend a lot of time there in verses 14 through 17. Just this conversation between the two, and the offers of great gifts if Daniel can figure this out for him and all that kind of thing. But for sake of time, let me jump you to verse 18. He says, O king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom and majesty, glory, and honor. Stop. Very first thing Daniel tells Belshazzar is what? God gave your father all the things that you now have in your possession. All the great kingdom that you now rule over, all the great blessings and benefits that you now have at your disposal came because of your father, and they came because your father was blessed by Jehovah God. First thing Belshazzar is going to have to realize that if there's anything of real benefit, it all came because of God, and all the glory and honor needs to be bestowed upon him because of that. Verse 19, and because of the majesty that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished, he executed. Whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up. And whomever he wished, he put down. But God empowered him with great power and influence. But, verse 20, when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. The minute your father decided that this was all about him rather than all about the God who had empowered him, he was brought down. Belshazzar, you're about to learn the same lesson. You're about to learn the lesson that your father had to learn the hard way as well. That though God may use you, though God may benefit you, though God may bless you at times, He can also decide that if your pride rises and you decide that all the power and benefit is within yourself, He can bring you down. He's simply reading the record of what had been happening in their history, and Belshazzar needs to come to terms with it. He was driven from the sons of men, verse 21. His heart was made like the beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. And they fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men, and appoints over it whomever He chooses. I can't imagine what that must have been like. It is hard for me to even visually conjure the idea that this great king, for a period of time until he finally got it, lived and was treated as a common animal. Fed like an animal. Dew upon his body like an animal would wake up to. It's a tremendously interesting kind of accounting. But notice verse 22. You knew all that, Belshazzar. You knew it was God that had glorified your father. You knew it was Him that had blessed him. And you knew the minute he got too high on himself, God made him like one of the beasts. You know all this. And yet, verse 22, you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this. I suppose we might have been benefited, and maybe you would have enjoyed it, maybe a 30-second lesson today, and just simply going straight to verse 22 and said that. Belshazzar, why did you do all this even though you knew what happened to your father? You knew what happened to Nebuchadnezzar when he let his pride get in the way, and yet you chose the same path and assumed it would be okay. I wish I could get that through to myself at times and to others at times. When somehow I convince myself, even though I have witnessed the consequences of choices, behaviors, and decisions of others, and I've seen what it's brought to their lives, I've seen what it's brought to their families, I have seen what it's created in their circumstances, and yet I didn't learn anything from it. And here I go as if I didn't know anything. I walk the same exact path, and make the same bad choices and do the same transgressional things and create the same challenges and problems. The 1-point lesson could have easily been this morning out of this text. Learn. When you witness what others have brought to themselves by their choices, learn. I've said a lot of times over the years in different types of sermons, there are basically in some ways two ways that you can learn things. And that's oversimplifying, I get it. But there are kind of two ways to learn things. You can learn things through experience, right? You can learn it by doing, and I get it. There are some things that's better, right? You want to learn to do math? Experience math, right? You want to learn how to play an instrument? Spend the time experiencing it, right? There are some things that you can't get past that experience level. But there are some things that are better learned through education, by being taught. I can touch the hot stove and learn through experience, or I can listen to my mom who says, "Don't touch the hot stove, it'll hurt you." I just assume learn it through education. You see the difference? Belshazzar should have learned through education. He should have witnessed what happened to his father. He should have witnessed the transgressions that he had committed and the consequences that came. He should have learned through education. But instead, now here he is, knock-kneed, trembling, countenance changed, because he's chosen the experience side of transgression rather than the education side. It's important. You knew all this, Belshazzar, and you still did this. And you have lifted yourself up, verse 23, you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see, hear, or know. And the God who holds your breath in his hands. Wow. You accredited it to gods of nothing, and you have ignored the God who holds your very breath in his hands and owns all your ways. You have not glorified. When the record is read, and the reality of Belshazzar's choices and decisions are revealed, it's painful. And Daniel wants him to know not just what the handwriting on the wall says, he wanted him to know why it had to be written. His education is not just, you've been weighed in the balances and found lacking. That's coming. But he wanted him to know, God wants him to know why. When that record is read, it's challenging. Let me take you to a couple of New Testament texts. Go over into Jude, the single chapter book of Jude, and look at verses 14 and 15. Now Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about these men also, saying, Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000 of his saints, to execute judgment on all, to convict all who are ungodly among them of all their ungodly deeds, which they have committed in an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. He reminds them that the record will be shown. All of that ungodly way and ungodly speech and ungodly actions, it's going to come into the open. And we need to be humbled by that fact and humbled by that thought, warned by it, and appreciate that let's be educated to make the changes needed rather than have to experience the kinds of calamities that Belshazzar does. Revelation 20, verse 11. Just a couple of pages over. Revelation 20, verse 11. Then I saw a great white throne and him who sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away, and there was found no place for them. And I saw the dead, small and great, standing before God, and books were opened. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged according to their works by the things which were written in the books. Now I realize we're dealing with imagery here, but think about that imagery. The record is kept. And it's humbling to think about, right? The record was opened before Belshazzar. Here's the record and the history that you should have learned and appreciated from, and he didn't learn anything from it. And it's kind of humbling to realize that someday I'll stand before God as well. And that when that book comes open, and is it possible that God will look at me and say, well, Brian, you saw that and didn't do anything changes about it, and you witnessed what that did to folks, and you chose that same path anyway, and you, just like the days of Belshazzar. That record is there, and it serves as a warning. It should serve as an aid to encourage us and lead us out. It reminds me a little bit of Luke chapter 16 in that scene with the rich man and Lazarus, and he's begging out. There's that really interesting phrase that Abraham uses with him when he says, son, remember. Remember everything you experienced in this life. Remember all the things that you encountered, and yet you... And one of the scariest parts in some ways about judgment is the fact that there will be a reminder, a remembrance about what choices and decisions that I made. Let's go back into the text. Daniel chapter 5. There are other narratives. I'll maybe save some of that for our Bible study time. Daniel chapter 5 again. Let's look at the end of the narrative. So then the fingers of the hand were sent from him, and this writing was written. And this is the inscription that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation, each word, Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Here you are celebrating, assuming that there's great things to conquer on the horizon, and God says to you, no, it's already been counted. And He's finished it. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. You think about those scales, those balances. And though you had every advantage of knowing the challenges that had been brought to your father, though you had every opportunity to know the changes and dispositions that you should have had in relationship to these things, you've been weighed in the balances and found lacking. Your kingdom has been divided, verse 28, and given to the Medes and Persians. And then Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a chain of gold around his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. If there's anything redeeming about Belshazzar, he honored what he said. Even though the message wasn't, I'm sure, what he wanted to hear, he honored what he said. And then that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. And the saddest part about this story to me is simply this. It didn't have to happen. If Belshazzar would have learned from the mistakes of his father, if Belshazzar would have appreciated where all of this benefit and glory had come from, if he had simply recognized any of the guidance that he had before him, if he had just honored what God had desired from him, none of this had to happen. And yet he fulfills the prophecies relating to all of these things and goes right down the path they had been warned and challenged to not walk. I'm asking you all and myself this morning, we're going to be weighed in the balance anyway, right? Every knee shall bow, every tongue shall confess. We're all going to get weighed in the balances anyway. So why not do all we can to honor God, serve God, love God? Why not make ready for that moment that we know is coming? And now you can't ever go out of this room and say, I didn't know that. We know that someday I will either willfully bow in great humble respect of the Father I have been serving and honoring all of my life, or I will be forcibly brought to my knees before the God who I've been ignoring and blaspheming and turning against all my life. It's coming. And how that scene looks will be different for different people. I'm simply not trying to scare you this morning, though if that's what it takes to get folks to serve God, then so be it, I guess, in some ways. But I would much rather just guide us and appreciate and lead us to know that God has power and that God can bring and has brought judgment. But it doesn't have to be a fearful thing if I'll just serve and love and honor Him now. And know His purposes and will for my life and serve it faithfully. And Jesus, our loving shepherd, calleth thee now to come. Enter the fold of safety where there is rest and room. Jesus sacrificed Himself so that we would have remedy and hope to the calamity of sin and challenge. He saves us from ourselves and our transgressions and prideful ways. What will you and I do with Jesus even today? Will I make ready for that moment that's inevitably coming for all of us? Or will I be filled with so much pride and obstinance as was Belshazzar that a sad moment of judgment's coming? Choice is ours. Which side of that equation we find ourselves is a decision we have to make, and if we could help you even make it today, then we humbly ask that you come.